This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. I guess you know by now, I have a preference for psychologists. They bring something extra to the conversation. Not surprising. They're keen observers of the human condition. They spend their lives observing, studying, analyzing the human condition. So many times, and I know you agree with me, to listen to an experienced psychologist is to walk away with an understanding or a way that you can improve yourself. That's the whole point. And this podcast is lucky enough to have had on so far some of the greatest living psychologists. My guest today is Melanie Katzman. She is a business psychologist, advisor, consultant to the world's top public and private companies. And when she's not knee-deep into the academic research, the psychological academic research, she went in a side tangent for our conversation today. She dives right into connecting first and many ways she has learned over the course of her career to ignite success, meaning, and joy. Think about it. Technology has connected us like never before. But so many people are freaking isolated. They're not talking to each other. They're not connected really. They're connected with this fake-like crap, but not in a real way, a human way. We forget how to establish respect. We forget how to engage all of our senses. Becoming popular? Actually, it's a good thing if done the right way. Diving into Melanie's world is to better understand how to have a big impact in life. That's what we all want. That's what we all need, even if we don't know it. Without further delay, let's jump right into my conversation with Melanie Katzman. Really, where I wanted to start was kind of the probing of minds. And you had an inkling, an idea that you wanted to go down this psychology path as a young person. Age 13, you already knew you wanted to be a psychology major. Now, we're going to have to unpack that because apparently you were a fairly advanced 13-year-old person. So what was the lead up to where you had that revelation so early?
It's so interesting to hear you use the word revelation because it didn't seem like a revelation. It just seemed like a natural evolution. My mother was the kind of person who always seemed to have time for everybody. There was a natural magnetism that she had. She would ask questions, be curious of what people are doing and how they were making their choices. And in retrospect, I realized she was demonstrating a lot of the skills that one gets trained to do professionally. She was the kind of person that just always had people around her talking, figuring it out. My dad was an entrepreneur. He was always trying to figure people out in a slightly different way, but ultimately our dinner table conversations were about the decoding of interactions, guessing what was going on. When I had an opportunity to be part of what was then called peer counseling, which was teenagers who were going from 7th grade into 8th grade, this big kind of shift at the time that I was in school, which was kind of going into junior high school, which is what it was called, that you had a chance to be mentored by your peers. And I loved it. And I ended up building out that program with the guidance counselor. At the time, it was a new idea. She and I and the program got a great deal of local attention. And before I knew it, I was going to other schools and holding little workshops, and I was smitten. That was it.
So what would have been happening exactly? Because that's pretty advanced behavior for a 13-year-old person. What would the therapy, what would the training that you were putting together, what insights would you have been giving to other 13-year-olds? Because you're going to see where I'm going with this ultimately, which is to bring it up to current day. But what would have been the issues that would have been the most on their mind at that point in time in history?
I can see where this is going. And so, what I would say is the biggest questions when you're a teenager are ones that we continue to struggle with today, which is, do I belong? Am I good enough? Where is my future going? How do I make choices? How do I make good choices? How do I avoid negative influences? How to deal with perhaps destructive thinking? A lot of the focus at the time with peers was, how do you handle transition? Because transition is a time when things feel destabilized, and that's kind of when all the molecules, if you will, are in active motion and we recombine them. And that can be terrifying and electrifying. That electrifying can be really positive or absolutely horrible. I think a lot of the focus then, as now actually in my work, is about how people make transitions effective and how we in day-to-day life find a way to feel like we belong and make a difference.
How do you feel about today, 2019? You talk to a lot of people, you see a lot of different things. What is the psyche of people right now? I happen to be calling you from Southeast Asia. I happen to have been avoiding the States for a decent period of time, but I do make my observations across the cable news shows.
I wanted to ask you about that.
I do make my observations across the cable news shows, and I enjoy being in a culture perhaps that is counter to what I see unfolding in the States right now. But what is your observation? What is going on if you put your doctoral hat on and you really try to analyze? This isn't not a political question or anything, but people seem to really be hurting right now.
Yes, and so I would say the predominant emotion is fear. That gets whipped up in uncertain times. With the amount of information we have, it's easy to either be well-informed or live in an echo chamber. Oftentimes, those echo chambers only amplify the conversations that make us unsettled. When there's a rapidly changing world that's uncertain, people can't actually get their signposts right, we lose our footing, we lose our confidence, we turn inward. And it's exactly what ideally should not happen during times of change or when we're facing the unknown. A lot of the reasoning behind Connect First was to counteract that, so that I gave people tools to make the human personal connection, which often demystifies what has become a very fearful world where anybody on any side of me might be trying to undermine me. I would say my overarching concern as I watch is that people are isolated, fearful, and doing exactly what they shouldn't, which is turning inward and cutting off information and relationships at the time that they need to open up their minds and their doors.
Do you think, given that you've got some perspective going back several decades, do you think that there's truly anything different about the rate of change right now, except that we have this all connected peer-to-peer, watch everybody, watch everything they do, social media world? So is the rate of change really any different than prior decades, or is it just the technology that has really put us into an odd place of observing everyone constantly?
I think that's exactly the point, isn't it? That what has happened is that we have sight lines into what's going on, and we have metrics against it. With social media, we are tracking likes and collecting followers, and as a result, aren't actually establishing true relationships. And there's a competition often around the wrong things, and there's just an opportunity to document, observe, debate what's happening around us. But I don't really believe the rate of change is different, but it's the way that we're metabolizing it, where it just feels like it's literally in our hand. Our phone is constantly buzzing and beeping with news and alerts. And so it's a very visceral reaction. As a psychologist, we are very aware of how our bodies get wired and trained to react to those beeps. They're sending off an electrical impulse that's activating our nervous system. It's not really the kind of thing where, oh, we have cell phone addiction and that's a soft kind of notion, it is really biologically wired, where we're becoming trained like Pavlov's dog, that we hear a ring and we turn and we look and we get anxious about what we're missing. I think it's just the way in which change sits in our hands, is with us every moment, is felt through our body in a very immediate way.
I'll give you an example, and perhaps you'll have one that counters or connects with the one that I'm going to give you. Recently, in the last year, there was a young guy. He was drafted in the first round by the Oakland A's. Then he was drafted in the first round by the NFL Cardinals, baseball and football first round. And he's a very small guy, but he was selected with the number one pick in the draft. He got a lot of money. He had his first NFL game last week. His first three quarters, he did terrible. He literally looked like he shouldn't be in the league. Then all of a sudden, he rallied his team and got to a tie. And, it was pretty exceptional. He really did exceptional in the fourth quarter. Now, the interesting thing there is not necessarily what I just told you. It's just the way people reacted. If you would have gone on Twitter, you would have watched, quote, responsible people, responsible voices, people that have careers and jobs, not just a regular Joe, but people that are kind of like supposed to be doing this for a living, literally just in the first quarter, the second quarter, the third quarter of one game, saying that the guy is over, he's done, he should never be there. And I just think this is happening across society. So my question comes to you is like, okay, I think I'm old enough to observe what's going on and see the game that people are playing. But I wonder if somebody who's 20 or 25 or even 30 who doesn't really have a pre-phone memory, how are they adjusting? There must be, from your perspective, there must be a difference because of this way this technology has come in at different age groups. For you and I, we still have some vague memory of pre-phone. Some groups don't have that.
Well, I think that this gets to a very important question around what is my public self, what is my private self, who is my real self? And it plays out in a number of different ways. So if I think about the younger population that I'm with, I often have to work with them on the ghosts that live on social media. And that can be past business relationships or past social relationships. It used to be that you could leave a job or break up and it went away. That's not the case. You can have this lingering cloud over you, whether it be the individual that you're with or a bad experience that you were a part of. Helping people distance from that is really a challenge. That requires, in many instances, creating your safe zone. Who are the people and relationships that validate you in the way that you want to be understood? That does require conversation. And that's not a text or a tweet. Oftentimes, I'm coaching people to pick up the phone, as intrusive as certain generations may feel that that is, or to have conversations where they're putting the phones to the side. There's such a challenge to present yourself as if, as you are alluding to, that if you listen to the way in which people are telling you who you are, you can really be undermined. If an athlete is seeing the tweets in the middle of a game, could you imagine what that would do to their mind? They have to stay focused. And in a lot of ways, we teach people how to be a good athlete, stay focused, and take away the distracting chatter. There's always chatter. There was chatter around us before there was technology, but the technology makes it loud and unavoidable.
Yeah, my example was some young guy who's now worth $40 million, and he's probably got a much stronger mental constitution in many ways. But I just imagine taking that example and extrapolating it out across the population, all different ages, and folks that don't perhaps have those resources, and perhaps those social media likes and that peer-to-peer connection is much more important because they don't have, for example, all that achievement and success yet.
Absolutely. And you can be cyberbullied, as we know, whether or not you are an NFL athlete or you are somebody who's 16 years old and you walked into the cafeteria in the wrong outfit. Those things really sting, and it's very destructive. It's, again, part of the reason why I feel the one-to-one contact, the group conversation is so important, because we construct these dialogues either on social media or in our head that aren't really valid. The technology is helping us have an interconnection and helping us having a public conversation, and in many ways, very useful transparency. But if that's the only way that we are connecting with people, we're going to really damage ourselves and our relationships.
I know one of the reasons that you wrote your book here is to let people that don't have the opportunity to sit down with you get some of that wisdom. But I do have the question for the overall population. I don't know if I'm really looking for a number, just some perspective from you. How do you see the population in terms of their need of having the chance to sit down one-on-one with you for that hour and really engage back and forth. I would guess that it's a very large number of people that need that one-on-one with someone like you, but don't get it.
I think that there's a range, right? So I'm a psychologist, a clinical psychologist, as well as a business consultant. So it's an unusual situation that I have people in my therapy practice that see me on an ongoing basis. I have people in my coaching practice that may be coming in during times of transition or strategic moments. And then I go into companies and I work with them sometimes on a long range retainer and other times just for a short period when, again, they're dealing with a particular transition or merger or acquisition or quick growth. What I see is a range of needs that people are presenting with. Certainly, there's those individuals who are struggling with deep mental health concerns that need access to a professional who can make a diagnosis, can connect them to treatment, perhaps if necessary, be sure that they get the kind of medication that they need. And that's one end of the spectrum. Then we have people who need to have deep listening and empathy. I shy away from the idea that therapy or coaching is a paid friendship, but it has elements of what a good friend can provide or a good mentor. That to have a place where what you have to say is what matters, that the world for that hour or so is around you and your opportunity to really think through what's going on, to feel what's going on, to hit the pause button. I think that there's a lot of people who would really benefit from those interactions. And that's something we can give each other, and you don't have to be a professional. But I would caution people around suddenly thinking you read a book and then you can be a psychologist for someone who's in extreme mental health distress. So I think we have to just be aware that there's a wide range of need when it comes to somebody needing a person to speak to.
Yeah, I think for sure, in the sense that decades and decades of experience to handle all the if-thens that might present themselves when they visit you in the office is not something that us armchair folks can readily dispense.
You could try. Why not? Just give a call when you hit an obstacle. But just know when it's time to give a call for a professional.
I will say this, though. Many times in my life, I've had conversations with people. They needed someone to tell them, hey, you might really want to chat with someone. I've done that many times, and you can just see that they have that need. It's time. There's a very obvious kind of blinking light sometimes you can just observe if you're paying attention. It's time. You need to talk to somebody.
It's so true, Michael. And then you're a wonderful bridge into a different set of resources. There's actually a gentleman in my practice who I saw yesterday. He has been referring professionals that he meets in his world, and he is in the private equity world. And it seems as though he is just the kind of guy that people open up to. They talk to him. He's very comfortable with his emotions. And as a result, he hears other people's. At a certain point, he'll say, you know what? Let me give you the number of my coach. This is now going beyond where I can comfortably have a conversation with you over a beer or over a coffee. He's doing, I think, a great service for people in normalizing that it's okay to speak to somebody, but also providing the ease for an individual to open up such that they can even make the identification that maybe I need a professional. It is so important to be able to practice that kind of deep, generous listening. And clearly, as a radio host, you have that skill. And I would imagine that when you're meeting people, you're doing the same thing. And that helps someone even recognize it feels good to talk. And then if you're making the suggestion and maybe talk to somebody else at a different level, you've really helped them move into a place where they can get the support they need.
I love being in a place where I know what I know. I love knowing that I know other people that know a lot more about other things that I don't know. I love that feeling because then it feels like, okay, first off, the world is way too big. There's too much knowledge. You have to cut it up into pieces. Because if you're trying to go through life trying to take it all in and you're going to be the master of everything, forget it. You're going to break down.
And in fact, you won't be as valuable to the people around you. Like I often think about how do I choose a doctor or a contractor? I want to know that they have relationships with people that can provide the services that are needed in the right way. So if you're the person who can connect individuals to the people who have the answers, I think you become more valuable. We often become so concerned about having all the answers or being able to provide the solution in an immediate way that we undermine our own effectiveness. It's the ability to know what you don't know and who might know it that I think really is the contributor to success.
Can I take you back to a point in time, though, an earlier time, before we jump into your work, your newest work, your book? I want to ask about something that I saw in your background, which I thought was interesting. And I'm sure I've read some of the story, but I'm sure you can describe it in an interesting way, which is early on in your career, you were involved with eating disorders, helping people to understand. And you made an interesting observation about those experts that were dispensing most of the eating disorder advice or insights themselves. They weren't generally women, but women were primarily the ones with these issues. Now, that doesn't mean that a guy can't give insights, but to your point, if it's primarily guys, that seems unusual.
Right. Would you like me to tell you about the gender differential or how I got into eating disorders?
All of it. I just want to keep learning.
Let me take you back in time to the early days when I was an undergraduate and I was working in Marty Seligman's Learned Helplessness Lab. Now, many people will know Martin Seligman because he's the professor who made learned optimism famous. He taught us how to think positively. My joke is always that when I was in Marty's lab, he was studying depression. I left and he got happy. What we would do is look at ways in which you could make somebody feel bad, to stop having agency on their environment. The way that you do that is that you give people no ability to affect what's going to happen. So we would work with rats. There would be the rats who could push a lever and they would get their food. Great, they have control. There were the rats that would push the lever, nothing would happen. But when the master rat would push, a light would go off and then they would get food. They had predictability. Then there were those who had no control and no predictability. They would just crawl up and sit in a corner. I started my career looking at the way in which appetite, the desire to eat, affected one's emotional state, how you can get somebody to literally stop trying. From that place, I understood that control over environment was incredibly important. Predictability would moderate the stress, and if you had no control and no predictability, there was a great likelihood that you would stop acting. That has actually been an undercurrent through a lot of the work I've done, which is helping people restore a sense of control, and if not control, predictability. In that setting, I became very interested in kind of what was called appetite disorders, and I started to look at ways in which people ate that were unusual. I, quote, discovered that there were people who were binge eating in the middle of the night, counteracting that with starving or exercise. And lo and behold, actually, there were people who did that during the day. This was not titled. Now we know that there's something called bulimia, but at the time it wasn't known. It was my first foray into the unknown, trying to document that which was in front of everybody, but wasn't really being seen. I did a lot of the early work to document bulimia, to identify ways in which we could counteract that. It was all focused on ways of restoring for women who were the predominant people who were reporting this behavior, a sense of control. So not making it about an appearance disorder or a vanity problem, but really a way in which women were modulating their stress, particularly at a time when women were entering the workforce. So I can go on from there, but that's really the link between, if you will, working with rats in an experimental lab to going to working with women and men, but it became clear that it was women who were struggling with what has become a diagnosis that has received a great deal of attention. And it was my early entrepreneurial efforts, if you will, in helping to define the diagnosis, the field, and the treatment.
I'm going to bring that particular point up to current because right now, if I look at America, we've got a real problem with overeating across the spectrum, men and women. At the point in time you were doing that work, just curious, were the women that would be in these behavioral circles, were they happy or unhappy?
Desperately unhappy. If you think about what we've struggled with in corporate America has been substance abuse, often targeted towards alcoholism, or in the go-go 80s when I was also starting my career, cocaine abuse, that the focus was how do we help people who are abusing substances that I've just identified. But actually, as more women were entering the workforce, what we saw was that on the female side, the abuse was with food. That was not a happy place. It may have been a false sense of happiness because I look better or I look more along the lines of what society is expecting me to look like, but it's not happiness inside. So it's actually interesting because I recently gave an interview about the effect of likes on Instagram posts and how that impacts one's self-esteem. And I said, it reminds me of the work I did in my early days about how people would get up in the morning, weigh themselves, and that number would dictate how they feel. Now people get up in the morning, they check their likes, and that number dictates how they feel.
I'm sitting here making a list of substances here, and now I've just included likes in my substances. The reason I asked you the question, which I kind of knew the answer to, because I wanted to add substances to it. So if we're talking about, okay, the women that were in the bulimia problems right there with issues and being desperately unhappy, I want to think, and this is just my uneducated view here, that folks that are regularly, for example, taking lots of coke or lots of alcohol or lots of weed, or all they want are likes all day long, or they're taking fentanyl and OxyContin, whatever, Adderall. It just seems like all of that stuff, and I really want to hear your professional psych view. It seems like all of that stuff doesn't exist in a truly happy person.
Well, because in part what we're doing is we're putting the responsibility of our happiness, our effectiveness onto something other than ourselves. Even if in the moment you're feeling better because of the substance you imbibed, what you're not learning is how to either soothe yourself, motivate yourself, translate your inner workings into outer, more positive behavior. People who are abusing substances, I think, are putting themselves in a position where they're making it harder to have the natural high that comes from an achievement or a good time with someone. That's not to say that I'm not sitting here going, oh, everybody needs to be stone sober all the time. You can't have a drink. It's just that there is an over-reliance that can happen where it undermines our self-esteem because A, we don't trust ourselves in the absence of the Adderall before the test, but also we are changing our biology such that we're not allowing our natural flow of neurotransmitters to do what they're meant to do.
I keep saying in this conversation, I'm going to shift you into where we're supposed to be today, but I just had to probe this background because it's so interesting. I could probably spend hours. You can see I just would start picking through the mind and try to connect things and figure things out. I mean, it's just what I do. It's what I like to do. It's fun because especially for folks that have gone down a path in a niche, they've become really interesting at what they do. That's just fun to kind of pull stuff out. But you have assembled a way, an understanding for people that are looking for this greater success, meaning, joy at work and at life. You've assembled 52, I almost want to say a deck of cards. I mean, you've assembled these 52 different ways to approach life, to approach finding that success, meaning, and joy. What's the background here? Why did this happen? What was the drive that was pushing you to say, I must assemble these insights? I'm guessing it's based off a lot of the things I've been asking you so far, all these different insights that you've put together over a career and saying, oh, let's synthesize this into a book.
That's the answer. That's exactly it. Having been fortunate to be somebody who could have a conversation on a very deep level with individuals and also be in the corporate boardroom, I would see that what people would discuss in their private moments often felt to them as if it was completely unique. There was this assumption that no one else is feeling the way I'm feeling. But of course, I could see that that wasn't true. There were certain universalities that existed no matter where I was working and no matter who I was working with. Because of the work I've done over the course of my life, documenting the way that political and social problems affect the individual, starting with how do cultural and political and social changes affect eating disorders and body images, to actually moving to how do these cultural and social changes affect gender dynamics, then diversity writ large. And so I came to a point in my career where, as a research scientist, having traveled and worked around the world, and as a consultant, having traveled and worked around the world, I saw certain universalities that I thought were worth reporting out, because people often suffer at work for things that feel so big, but are actually more easily remedied than anybody would like to think. The book is really my gift back, if you will. It's the accumulation of my experience, and it's a way of saying it doesn't always have to be this hard. You don't have to suffer.
So, your number one first chapter, I must share today. I was having a conversation with a lady in my life. She's a true sweetheart. She's as nice as she can possibly be. And she said to me today, she said, well, people think I'm very serious. And I said, okay. And she said, but then when they get to know me and, I'm smiling a lot, then they really think I'm really fun and nice. And I said, well, why don't you just smile when you first meet them? What a huge thing. I've been in an Asian country for many years, and people are more reserved and more shy. But it's the amazing icebreaker. And this applies to America. It applies to anywhere. But when you smile, it just changes everything.
It's interesting that you should say that, and I appreciate it, because when I was putting the book together, I chose to start it with a smile. The book ends with a chapter on dreaming. So we really go through a whole journey of starting a connection with the most basic, which is a smile, and then moving on to much more complex interactions. There was feedback initially of, can you start a book with a smile? People are going to think that this is just kind of fluffy stuff. It's like, but I had to start with a smile because it's critical to establishing that immediate connection. We are hardwired to respond to someone who smiles. I smile, you smile back, you don't even realize you did it. And it changes the interaction immediately. As you said, your colleague who doesn't smile is experienced as a certain way, independent of who she really is, because she's giving out a cue that is read as either disinterested, cold, off-putting in whatever way. I had to start the book with a smile. Interestingly, I did a post where I just had a smiley face, and it has gotten thousands of responses, which tells me that there is a real recognition of the need to smile because you want to, not because somebody is yelling at you as you're walking down the street. Hey, lady, give me a smile. But I'm smiling because I want to smile, because I know it's going to have a positive warming effect on the environment around me.
I don't think people even think about those that perhaps are hesitant to smile, don't think about all of those potential benefits that come from it. I mean, I would not be having this conversation with you. I'm not some kind of like crazy extrovert. I'm pretty introverted, but when I meet with people, I'm genuinely interested in them. I want to hear what they have to say. And if you don't smile, you don't connect. And so this is your very first chapter, but it's like, and you say, well, it's kind of basic, but it's the basics that people are screwing up.
You say it really well. The basics get screwed up. And if you screw up the basics, the other stuff doesn't happen. So I start the book really looking at things that you know you should do, but oftentimes people forget. Smile, say please, say thank you, share praise. It seems, quote, obvious, but if it was so obvious and easy, why isn't anybody doing it? I mean, some of the ways in which people get derailed at their jobs is because they feel so badly about themselves. They don't feel recognized. They don't feel accepted because they're not getting the basic human interaction. They walk in and no one smiles and says hello. This is the gold dust of setting a good foundation. Even though it may feel like the most basic, people screw up the basics. So if you don't get the basics right, it's really hard to build the foundation, to build something on a shaky foundation. So lay your foundation, get the basics right, and then you can move on from there.
Now, this is an interesting thought that I'm having here about the workplace itself. So today, there are some phenomenal companies that are just booming and going like crazy. Then there's some old standards that have really interesting workplace environments, and the boss, the CEO, has thought through those environments. But I would say some of the high-tech companies, and perhaps some of those banks up there in Manhattan, those kinds of places are sort of like, hey, you're lucky to get in the door. And when you get in the door here, we're going to drive you like a horse or something, and you're going to work like crazy to get all that gold at the end of the rainbow. Now, that's a difficult one because in some ways, you might not realize till after you get the gold that it was not worth it.
Yes. And that actually was one of the things that I saw over time, that I would work with companies that had people who were extremely driven. They had their blinders on because that was the way they were being reinforced. They needed to drive to an end goal. Then the companies went public. They got their payouts, and suddenly people were lifting their eyes from their desk and going, there's a world out there, and I've missed it. I don't know what's going on in my community. I don't really have friends. I may have lost my spouse. Who are my children? I saw how people really suffered great loss at a moment in time when they also were seen to have made tremendous professional strides. And that was one of the motivators for me in my professional work, to try to build bridges between people who wouldn't otherwise meet, because there were so many people in positions of power and influence who were not connecting to building bridges with individuals around them in their office or in their community because they were so singularly driven on the result at the end.
As I go through your 52 cards, so to speak.
By the way, Michael, it absolutely is a plan. These are cards. Companies can use them as cards. Or it's a calendar, so you can have 52 obviously weeks in a year, so you can pick to do one of these suggestions each week. It was purposeful. My son said to me, 52, Mom, no one's going to ever read that. That's far too many. It's overwhelming. I was like, well, it depends on your perspective. Because if you want to do something each week, then 52 is just a program. The book isn't written that it has to be read that way, but it certainly is there if you want it.
But I was thinking about one in particular. Actually, this is an entire section about becoming popular. It's such an interesting phrase because I think for a lot of people, it's instantly going to harken to high school. Like, hold on, I have to be popular? First off, if we start talking about smiling, that's like the first step to becoming popular. I want you to reframe it and recast the word popular. It's not fake that you're talking about. It's a genuine popularity based off bringing a real spirit to the interaction with other people. It's not like you're trying to be some fake schmuck. This is about being real.
Yeah, so I actually chose be popular to be evocative because too often work feels like the middle school cafeteria, that people will come in and they want to belong, but there's the mean people and there's the people who they don't feel like they can approach. And there's an awkwardness that we feel when we're growing up. And going back to your earlier questions about my peer counseling when I was in junior high school, actually, there's a lot of that comes with us throughout our life. And that we all want to be the person, or hopefully want to be the person that people want to be with. So when I use popularity as a word, I meant to be evocative because I want to bring people to an emotional place where it's like, yeah, actually, I do want to be included. I want to include others. And here's how I'm going to do it. When I talk about popularity in the book, it's about being present, really making people feel like when they're with you, they matter, sharing information so that you're coming into situations where you are generously sharing what you know. I always instruct or coach my clients to bring conversational gifts, do your homework, figure out a way in which you are showing up with a knowledge of the individual such that they feel seen and cared for. Even knowing how to enter matters. People think I have to walk into a room and dominate it. It's like, no, you need to walk into a room and understand it. I go through in the book a number of different ways in which people can, quote, become popular. And it's not this, I want to be the cool kid, but it's, I am the person who people want to invite onto their team. When I call and you see my name coming up on the caller ID, you want to pick up the phone. You want to return my email or my text.
You're giving people techniques to get to this end.
Yeah, absolutely. It's to make you attractive in the positive sense of attractiveness, like a magnet. You pull people in because that's really where our interpersonal effectiveness comes from. It comes from you wanting to bring me information and me knowing that you will give information. I mean, how many companies have been undermined because people knew what was going on but were afraid to tell their bosses? You don't want people to be afraid to speak to you. You want people to want to walk through your door when you invite them in.
In your Become Popular section of the book, you also have something that is kind of provocative, which is, I think for a lot of people, is to have an opinion, have a view, have a point of view. I do have one. I don't think I'm terribly controversial. Some people might think so. But I do find that the trick here on having a point of view is that when you're talking with someone else, they've got a point of view too. You got to say to yourself, well, hold on. I'm just one person with a point of view. They're a person with a point of view. They're a person. I'm a person. I don't want to be in death blows with them if we happen to have a different point of view about some issues.
It's a really good clarification that you're making. And that is, in companies, too often people shuffle information around and don't add additional perspective. When I suggest that people have a point of view, it's do your homework. Don't just come in and report what's obvious. Open up your aperture, look around your environment, look across disciplines, talk to diverse voices, come in with an informed point of view that isn't just a repetition of what everybody knows. That's additive. I encourage people to talk with those that they admire around an organization and learn how they cultivate their point of view. What are they reading? What are they looking at? What are they listening to? So that when you have a point of view, it's not to come in dogmatically and push it on somebody, but it's coming in and saying, I am bringing new information because I care enough about this interaction that I want you to leave our conversation smarter than when it started. The chapter after have a point of view is you don't always have to be right. You honed right in on it. It's like, yes, have a point of view, but equally realize that there are many points of view out there, and that's where the fun begins.
Yeah, these are such prescient points in terms of what you've pulled together, because it's a day and age where we talked about it at the beginning of this conversation, that people are so emotional right now. Everyone's decided I'm in this camp or I'm on this team. There's no scientific method. There's no appreciation that there might be another person on the other side of the coin to me. There's no real sharing. It's really, really troubling to keep observing. I guess where I'm really going with this particular thought, to let you run with it, is it doesn't seem like the path that we're on is changeable. I mean, you're making a dent here. You're trying to make a dent. I try to make a dent with the podcast, but it sure seems like that social media connection is stronger than anything that you or I might do.
Well, what I'd like to believe is that the social media connection has been many dots, many pointless dots building up a surrealist picture. But those little dots are not on their own as powerful as a quality interaction. So I think that there is an opportunity to counter what's happening in social media by having the human face-to-face, ideally, or at least person-to-person discussion. That's where I'm an optimist. It's interesting because although I look at the world and I see what's broken, ultimately what gets me out of bed in the morning is I believe that people can change. That's what my career has shown me. I'd like to think a realist, but I'm also an optimist. It's not nilly optimism. You have to do things to make things be different, but I do believe that people can change and they can change their point of view. But what you're addressing, which is this fear factor, is one of the things that happens when we feel like we're under threat. It activates our cortisol. It activates our adrenaline. And what happens when we're under threat is we either fight or we flight. We stop thinking, all of the blood goes into our extremities, and we figure out either we're going to attack or we're going to run away. Basic animal instinct. That's the worst thing that can happen, because if we're living in fear, we are not using our brain. The blood isn't even in our brain. We're running, we're hiding, or we're fighting. The flip side of that is oxytocin, which is the bonding hormone. That's what happens when you are connecting. And when oxytocin is released, we actually calm down, we can listen better, we are less afraid, we can experiment. And so there is a biological benefit to having the conversations. But because we are so poisoned, if you will, by our fear and our adrenaline, we often don't have that experience. So my hope is, in my own small way, in writing this book, I give people a chance to have a biological hack, if you will, to actually start to feel that oxytocin, that calming, and that in its own way has an addictive quality.
You lay out all those points, those directions, those paths that we should all follow, the things that we should be doing either in the workplace or in our life. And some people might say, well, my gosh, this is common sense. Well, not really anymore, I don't think. It's very uncommon. If it was so common, I think we'd have a much smoother ride, especially in America, which doesn't seem to be very calm these days and doesn't seem to be very happy, at least on the outward appearances. It seems like there's a lot of restlessness, and it seems like there's a real need for conversation.
I've written 5 textbooks that are research-based, heavily data-driven, written for the professional audience. They hopefully take complex ideas and make them more digestible, but they basically were written for the academic. In writing this book, I realized I ran the risk of people saying, but this is common sense, isn't this obvious? And I thought, I have to be courageous and say, yes, these are things that you should know or do know, but if people were practicing it, I wouldn't be writing the book. I wanted to codify all of the lessons that not only I have taught others, but they have taught me over the course of time. Each one may seem simple, but the aggregate of all of them is a tremendous impact. And that's where it's exciting. is that for all the reasons that you're describing, we are at a moment in time where we risk having so many relational ruptures, but there is a way out of that. And it isn't hard and it isn't expensive and it doesn't require that companies spend a fortune on offsites or redecorating their offices with mission statements. It's getting back to basics that don't cost a lot of money, that don't take a lot of time, and put the controls back in the individual's hand, which goes back to my original premise, which is we stop acting if we don't think that we have a chance of making a difference. And I wanted to give people a way to make a difference.
Very cool stuff, Melanie. I could probably go back in time and send me 5 textbooks. I'd probably go through those and start saying, okay, let's get really granular here. I would probably enjoy. The book, Connect First, 52 Simple Ways to Ignite Success, Meaning, and Joy at Work. I keep saying, though, and life, but it really is life, too. I mean, really true, right?
Yes, but it's really true. It's so funny, Michael, because talking to you, I feel like you must have been sitting in on our editorial meetings when I was with the publisher trying to decide how to position the book, because we kept going back and forth about the life question. I ultimately said, I want the book only to focus on business interactions. Of course, this is advice for life, but in a way, I worried that if people saw it as advice for life, it would feel like a nice self-improvement option, not a critical business imperative. I kept all of my examples to what happens at work. We spend so much time in our jobs, and particularly given the world of technology, we're always on, we're always at work. I wanted people to see that the workplace is a place to drive social change and personal happiness. You're 100% right. All of these tips would apply to life, but I wrote the book with the title At Work because I didn't want work to squirm out of it. Like, oh, well, I'll just do that after work. It's like, no, wherever you go, that's where you are. Be the person at work that you want to be or should be at home. Be an integrated self and make your work life matter. That's why I very actively kept out the life in the title, but it's absolutely there.
You might have guessed this by my questions over the course of this hour. I had to add the life part because you're talking to Mr. Freelance here. I don't know what a boss is. I really don't know what coworkers are. I take from it from me, from the person that's outside of that system. Is it useful to me? And the answer is yes. So that's where I'm coming from too.
Well, I'm really glad to hear you say that. Actually, given the way that our economy has been structured and many other worldwide economies are, there's so many people operating outside of the established corporate structure that I wanted to write a book where people would see the importance if you are a part-time worker, a remote worker, a freelancer, because how you relate to the systems are the same. You have different opportunities to relate, but ultimately, whether you sit in a cubicle or you sit on a beach and call in, that you still have to have a way of working with your colleagues. That was also part of my motivation writing the book, is I didn't want to be another like titan of industry book where you have to have a big corporate structure behind you to be able to make this make sense. It's like, no, actually there's examples in the book about people who run food trucks.
They're universal points. My mom would take them, and even if she's not working right now, but she would be like, oh yes, this is anybody, any thinking person that's going to be self-reflective is going to. Now, of course, if you're out somewhere there on the loose and unfortunately you're taking too much OxyContin or something, it might not be useful for that individual, but let's hope they get off it and they can wake up and come back to the normal world and join us.
Right. If you're off taking artificial OxyContin, come into a mindset where you can get oxytocin, which is natural, and that gives you a great buzz. OxyContin, not so good. Getting the natural buzz from just doing the right thing with people around you, that's pretty incredible.
Yeah, the natural buzz is where it's at. I know you said at the beginning, you don't want to, you're not trying to say, hey, I'm not trying to tell you can't have a beer, a glass of wine or whatnot, but there is something to be said for us all to be honest and say, when you do have that moment, whether that moment is the smile or making love or a hug or yoga practice, don't try and convince me that those feelings are not higher than all the substances, because I think they really are.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hey, where's the website we can send people? Where can we direct them to? Where would you like to send people?
Sure. So follow me on Twitter, Instagram at Melanie Katzman, Melanie, Melanie, Katzman, Katzman. And on Facebook, it's Melanie Katzman, PhD.
Melanie, thank you for your time tonight.
Wonderful to be with you. Thanks so much for having a great conversation.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.